Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
And welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here, as always, with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, my friend. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you, Todd. So Susan Sontag has written a lot of things, but in her writings, you can see that she clearly favors the art of skillful attention. One of my favorite quotes of hers is that she says, "Do stuff, be clenched, curious, not waiting for inspiration's shove or society's kiss on your forehead. Pay attention. It's all about paying attention. Attention is vitality. It connects you with others. It makes you eager. Stay eager." I love that so much because we want eager. We want eager learners. We want eager listeners. We want eager politicians. And we want eager lovers. So the question is, why are we not able to stay eager or manage to engage with society whose members are eager? And so there are some barriers, so we certainly have entered the age of attention. First, we need to understand what it means to pay attention. Then we need to get our attention under our control. And finally, we need to help those who are most vulnerable with their attention skills and lack the insight to know that attention really matters. And it's our responsibility to help them become more skilled. So unless and until that happens, we won't have a compassionate society. So that's why we have this wonderful guest today, a personal favorite guest, my friend, Courtney Stevens. She is a developmental cognitive neuroscientist and associate professor of psychology at Willamette University in Portland, Oregon. She completed her undergraduate degree at Reed College and her master's and doctorate at the University of Oregon. She is an expert in development and plasticity of the human brain, including the role of stress and early socioeconomic adversity on neural system. In the course of her research, Courtney has partnered with preschool, K-12, and college programs to study factors that influence students' academic success and emotional well-being. Her research has been funded by NSF and NIH, and she has been presented with several national awards for excellence in teaching and neuroscience outreach. So I cannot wait to start my conversation. Courtney, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sucheta. Thank you so much for having me.
So my first question is, let's start with attention. Can you go over with us the mechanism of selective attention or attention in general? And what bearing does it have on learning and thinking and overall life's behavior?
One of the things that we think about a lot in psychology and in neuroscience is that attention is not just one thing. And so there's different aspects of attention. And the specific aspect that I study is called sustained selective attention. And the idea here is our world is complex and there's so many things going on around us. But if there's something that importantly we want to focus on, are we able to focus on, and it can be a sight, it can be a sound, it can be an idea that's in our head, but can we focus on that to the exclusion of really the myriad distractions that are around us? So that's the skill that I study. And it's amazing. Children as young as 3 have this ability. And that might seem surprising on its face, but if you ever watch a child who might be engrossed in a certain activity and sort of able to resist distractions, you can see that sort of focus coming online. And one of the questions I have is, how do kids, and even as we become adults or college students, how do we develop that ability to choose what we're going to focus on and really sort of tune our brains, and how does our brain activity change when we're focused on a particular thing and really excluding all of these distractions?
It sounds like if we don't possess this ability, or if this ability is not strong enough, then it really can impact our capacity to do deep work. And only deep work can lead to complex and abstract idea formation or coming up with good decision making, isn't it?
Absolutely. One of the phrases that we use in our research is really thinking of selective attention potentially as a force multiplier. And so it's a skill that you can apply in a lot of different domains, and that can really allow the sort of deep thinking that you're talking about. And to the extent that someone doesn't have that ability, right, in some ways we are sort of held hostage to all of the sort of intrusions and distractions around us. And there's 100 distractions around us. Anyone who has looked at a phone and had different alerts coming up, worked on a computer, or just walked down the street. And so really it's this challenge and task of when you're in a safe environment, right? This isn't about missing distractions that might alert you that a car is coming that might run into you. But how are we able to sort of focus our attention in that? Sort of in our view with the scientific group that I've worked with, is we really think of it as an absolute necessary precursor and component of any kind of learning that happens in a classroom or outside of a classroom.
So how does this paying attention look like at the brain level?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Folks have been studying this since the 1970s, and they started out looking at this question in adults, pretty what we might think of as actually boring experimental paradigms. But researchers were able to record the activity of large groups of neurons in the brain and look at how does the activity of these neurons change if you are focusing on one set of sounds, and it might have just been a series of small beeps presented at a particular pitch, when you were focused on those sounds versus a different set that might be presented at the same time. And what this early research found in the 1970s was that within a tenth of a second, your brain is actually changing its neural activity to the stimuli that you're focused on versus what you might be actively ignoring. And the way brain activity changed, it was almost as though the brain had a volume control knob. And you could sort of turn up neural activity on the information that was being focused on, that you were actively processing. But at the same time, it was like your brain had a dampening function and could turn down the volume on information that's distracting. What we've really looked at in about the past 15 years is trying to say, how early can we see that brain activity in young children during development? And first we saw it in 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and now we've gone down as young as 3-year-old children. We can see this basic process of, again, the analogy I use is turning up the volume on attended information, and it's happening within a tenth of a second. And so we can really think of the brain being dynamically adaptive, which is tremendously powerful. Again, we could imagine a different universe where the world just processed sensory information that came in, and we had no power to sort of choose one thing to prioritize and focus on over another. But it turns out this is a skill, again, available to very young children, and that has this long developmental time course in terms of increasing in our ability to stay focused on something for a long period of time, or select and focus on something and have better ability to resist distractions.
So is it fair to say that every 10 seconds when brain has complete capacity to kind of say that whatever we are paying attention to or focusing on can fade away, but you have to intentionally not let it fade away. And that intentionally not letting it fade away is selective attention?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great description. And some people study what we call reflexive attention. And that might be if right now a door slammed in the room you're sitting in, your attention would automatically be grabbed to that, loud, sudden, unexpected noise. But then can you reorient and refocus on whatever it is that sort of you want to volitionally focus on?
And, my experience of last 20 years working with people with brain injury as well as ADHD, this refocusing and reorienting is a huge weakness for them.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because part of my interest in selective attention from a developmental perspective was this idea that aspects of attention have been implicated in nearly every developmental disorder.
Yes.
So not just disorders that we think of as being part of attention, but you mentioned possibly brain injury as well. We see aspects of attention that might be different in kids who might have specific language impairment or might have difficulty with stuttering. And so one of our questions is understanding in what way is attention different? And going back to the idea of attention being important and foundational to really everything we do, how might that insight potentially be used in terms of therapies or approaches to dealing with a range of different developmental phenomena? one piece to add there is you said you've observed that sometimes there can be difficulty really reorienting or refocusing attention. And sometimes we do speak about that as kind of sticky attention. Your attention gets pulled to something, and then how hard or how difficult is it for you to reorient and refocus on something else? And that is definitely a skill that we see implicated in a lot of different developmental disorders.
So is it different then to think about knowing what to pay attention to and continuously paying attention to that versus once you had already made a good choice of what to pay attention to, but then something else pulled your attention away? Because I see both of these to be a significant problem, like the executive attention, knowing what to pay attention to, that discernment. How does neuroscience understand that?
Yeah, no, I think your clinical insight there is one of fractionating or representing these different pieces of attention. And so one piece, and I might even break it down further, is do I have the executive function ability to know what I want to focus on? But within that, are you able to sort of pick out that stream or piece of information you want to attend to and filter out the distractions? And then let's say you get your attentional filter set and you have managed to lock in on the right thing. Can you hold and sustain attention there? Some models of attention say that it's a different set of neurotransmitters, it's a different set of brain systems that then help with that sort of sustained locking on piece. Typically, though, what I would argue is that kind of continuously, assuming you are operating in our real complex world, you may have locked onto something, but you have to continually be filtering out these potential distractions. And so I think it kind of remains these different aspects of attention sort of really working in concert.
Then how do we explain to people that multitasking is terrible? and is it a myth really? And can we confidently tell people that? Which I've been doing that for years.
Yeah. So I would love to run some modern studies on today's generation of teenagers and adolescents. Typically, what we have said as dogma is that the idea of multitasking is a myth. What you do is you rapidly toggle or switch back and forth between two tasks, and someone may be able to switch back and forth relatively quickly, but there's always going to be what we think of as a switch cost. And so, in other words, we can't really be doing two things at once. And as we move back and forth between two things rapidly, we have a little bit of a cost or a consequence on the rapidity or the efficiency of what we're doing. So that, what you've told people, that's what I learned when I was getting my PhD, what I continue to say. I am curious because more and more, and perhaps college students have always said, or adults have always said, but I can multitask. But I am curious about the idea that perhaps people who have been raised in a different generation of living on a phone where you have multiple things going on at once, I don't know the extent to which the younger generation might be better, more efficient at this. And I'm not sure, and it's possible someone will be listening to this today and will say, well, I just read a research study a year or two ago that addresses it. But I wonder the extent to which our technological world might be changing sort of our ability to perhaps not actually multitask, but to move back and forth more efficiently between multiple tasks.
The new comparable concept of opposing thumb in evolution. Mm-hmm. But I have read Jean Twenge's work, and she talks a lot about this exposure to technology has incredible negative impact on mood, just attention, but that social connectivity. And certainly I think people are, if not directly, one may possess maybe capacity to, as you mentioned, toggle between the two equally important or competing information and not wanting to make a categorical decision of one being better. But it is eventually kind of separating you in terms of how well you feel or your sense of contentment or satisfaction. Mm-hmm. So that certainly is a concern.
There's a lot of research looking at associations between spending time on social media and does it make you perhaps feel worse about your life if oddly you might be comparing it to someone's very carefully curated pictures of vacations and everything that's wonderful in their life. So I do have a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of research out there suggesting that somewhat paradoxically, some of our social media tools might leave, some people feeling more disconnected.
So how do we understand the developing brain and these skills that are in the state of flux? They're going to get better and better with time. But how do neuroscientists understand this relative strength and weaknesses? And why should we intervene? Because yes, a 9-year-old is going to be less skilled than a 5-year-old when it comes to paying attention. But if you take 2 5-year-olds or 2 9-year-olds, one is certainly showing some strength, then it's going to become a burden on the one who is not showing the strength, right?
Yeah. And so I'm actually going to address that question sort of thinking about it in 2 ways. So first is, what do we know about typical predictable development that might be a difference between a 3-year-old and a 9-year-old, a 9-year-old and a 15-year-old, and so on? And one of the sort of big imbalances that happen in development that, researchers talk about is sort of, on the one hand, slow development of our prefrontal cortex. And obviously the name of your program, think a lot about sort of top-down executive control ability to regulate, manage emotions, make decisions, be planful. And that's structurally one of the slowest developing parts of the brain, continue to see functional improvements kind of into the 3rd decade of life. But the imbalance, especially during adolescence, is you can have sort of a hyperactive, what we call the limbic system. And so areas of our brain that might be particularly responsive to potential rewards or risks. And so if you have this imbalance, it's sometimes thought of as part of what might underlie, for example, adolescent risk-taking behavior. If you think now about a 3 or a 2-year-old, there might be a really, really, really underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. And so again, you might be a little bit more vulnerable or reactive to different emotions. So we've got this sort of general developmental trend across time. But now the second approach, and your question is really getting at thinking about individual differences of kids who might be at around the same developmental stage. And one way many people think of particularly aspects of selective attention is, does a younger child get control over managing the body? Part of it can be managing emotions, being able to transition or make a plan and follow a plan. And there are some different tools or strategies that we can think of as helping in that ability. And one of them, and this is funny, is language development. And so to the extent that as a 4-year-old, let's say, something goes wrong and is disappointing to you, and you have a language and a vocabulary to say, oh, well, and make a different choice. Perhaps one of your playmates is playing with the doll that you want to play with. Are you going to get upset and sort of lose sort of all ability and all happiness, or can you, using language and part as a tool, to sort of redirect attention? So the second piece is really thinking about your question of individual differences within kids who might be at a similar developmental stage. And at that point, obviously there's individual differences in a child's sort of biological development and biological reactivity, but kids might also differ in terms of the sets of tools or strategies that they have developed through part of their environment. So language turns out to be a big strategy that can be used in terms of processing and speaking aloud, both potentially to make a plan for something that a child might want to do, but also in terms of bringing about some self-regulation skills when a child is younger. So let's take an example. I used to volunteer in a preschool. And one of the things that would sometimes create a huge meltdown for a child is if a child wants to play with a particular toy that another child is playing with. And so one option might be for the child just to have a complete meltdown and to cry because someone else is playing with the doll. And I think anyone who's a parent or has worked with kids has seen this. But one type of really simple verbal tool that a child might have is to be able to verbally say, oh, well, I can, and then to choose some sort of alternative. And so language can become sort of this cue for redirecting attention and moving from, if we think back to something you might be stuck on, this unhappiness that someone else is the toy you want to play with, to use language to re-cue yourself to something else that's more positive. So that's one example. Other examples we might think of that might be outside of a child's control, there's certain things that can sort of be more soothing, may not be the right word for a child, and that's having consistency and predictability and routine. So some children, if their schedule is highly chaotic or just inconsistent and not known and transparent to the child, that child might be sort of in a more heightened, aroused, or stressed state. And in that state, we can imagine being sort of a little bit more vulnerable to these blips or captures of attention and more difficulty with using prefrontal skills to kind of regulate and bring things back down.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a very important point in terms of that language proficiency, that a self-directed language, which is the self-talk, that also can mediate your whole plan. How do I execute something? How do I organize it? How do I say this to myself? Or rather, in order to let this plan come to fruition, I can talk to myself. And those developmental milestones are very critical in self-regulation. Yeah, I'm very much familiar with that being an important aspect of readiness, so to speak. So now I think you've laid such fabulous foundation for us to understand attention and its importance in being ready. Can you talk? A lot of your work has been in the low socioeconomic or families or children growing up in low socioeconomic background. And so socioeconomical inequality is not just limited to who is getting reduced lunch versus who has access to books or doesn't have access to books, but it creates specific neurocognitive disadvantages. And their implications can be far-reaching. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, so sort of just also delay some of the broader foundation and history of these questions on socioeconomic background is a number of studies have really looked at to say, if someone has grown up in a lower socioeconomic background, why is it that 30 years later that person, may have become a doctor, yet is still more likely to have heart disease and other chronic illnesses than someone who grew up in a higher socioeconomic status background? Why is it that you might be able to make different predictions having to do with schooling outcomes or cognitive testing, and what might be some of sort of early risk factors that might somehow leave a lasting imprint? And one thing that the research group I'm part of has really looked at is whether aspects of attention might be different, and even sometimes been linking this to the function of some physiological systems. And so the first study we did on this, it was published back in 2008. And what was interesting was simultaneously another research group in Canada was publishing a very, very similar story from a little bit older adolescents.
Oh, really?
But if you go back and think about what we were talking on earlier of sort of the brain being able to turn up or down the volume of information that you've selectively focused on, what we found was that young kids who were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds sort of had less ability to turn down the volume on information that was distracting and irrelevant to the task at hand. And again, simultaneously, another research group in Canada found the same thing with older adolescents. And this was really interesting to us, sort of thinking about and the language changes in terms of thinking, well, is this a deficiency or might this be adaptive in certain contexts? And something we started out thinking about was with selective attention, right? You need to assume that there aren't threats in your environment that you need to be responsive to, and that there's one thing that you might want to focus and spend dedicated time on, and everything that's coming in is most certainly an irrelevant distractor. In some environments, it might be adaptive to be aware of potential distractors and not to completely block those things out. And so we tend to frame this as a difference, but it's definitely a difference in selective attention as a skill, a difference in terms of the neural mechanisms that are supporting this skill. And then fundamentally, if we think of certain environments, and a classroom is certainly one of them, where there might be a number of different distractions, but something that one needs to focus on, if for whatever reason one is less adept at turning on this skill, it might have consequences both for learning in general and for setting up some neural systems that might be important for things like language. So this is where we think of selective attention as a skill that in a particular mode or scenario or situation you want to have the ability to turn it on. And if you turn it on, for that system to be working effectively and efficiently. What we don't know in some of these studies is sort of why the kids are having a greater difficulty sort of turning down the volume on what's distracting. And so, it could be a difficulty really picking out and locking into the one stream that is the focus of attention. Another possibility is wanting to remain vigilant and aware of other things that are going on, because it's always possible that those things might become relevant.
Yeah, I had another wonderful guest a couple of weeks ago, Elise Davis McFarland. She is our recent past president of the American Speech and Hearing Association, ASHA, and her research focuses on the same socioeconomic background and language skills, and particularly the differences in parenting. And one of the interesting things that I think that she was talking about, that it can really impact the way you treat or approach or provide support. Because if you bring this model of deficiency, then you are going to consider that child less skilled. But if you bring this model of adaptive, that the child has met the necessary challenge in his environment to be vigilant so that he can respond appropriately to the threats that he perceives on a regular basis, then it is appropriate. And we should take the time to really recognize the skill that went into it. And then that just completely changes our compassionate outlook to that child's need, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things that we have thought about, so we've done a lot of work in our research group partnering with Head Start programs, which are federally supported preschool programs for families that are living in poverty. And one of the things that we have found and is helpful as strategies for families is, number one, recognizing that life is crazy. Life is crazy and it's busy. And again, there's a set of strategies that families have developed. There's sets of strategies that kids have developed that work within the environment. And one of the pieces that we've tried to help families do is, typically there is some kind of schedule, but often it's not transparent to the child. So for example, growing up, I moved back and forth between a few different households in the course of a week. And many of the families that we work with, the same is true. And so a kiddo might spend some time with grandma and grandpa, perhaps some time with mom, perhaps some time with dad. And while mom and dad might know the schedule, often for the child who's 4 years old, there's not an awareness of, where am I sleeping tonight? And this can be sort of stressful and chaotic. And so we try and support and help families in terms of creating a visual schedule that makes it visually apparent to the child and can be reviewed of, here are different colored houses and where I might be staying this evening, and just building in some of that structure and predictability.
And you kind of you have done a lot of work with this Head Start program. I'm hoping you'll go a little bit into the details of that. What does your particular research study looked at children-centered versus parent-centered approaches and combining the two? But one quick comment I was going to make about this whole making a schedule transparent, making expectations more explicit, and also having consistency of expectations can bring so much stability. And what I find that, I have a private practice by nature of that. Because it's a private practice, I serve a lot of community that is not from that low socioeconomic background, but it's the opposite. But I find the same chaos, just it taking different shape, and parents never thinking that this kind of explicitness adds any value to the child's ability to respond or learn or perform. They just think that children, I don't even know what they think, but they think children just imbibe these skills by inhaling oxygen around them.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think we can think of that predictability thing as something that obviously crosses different social classes. And for some kids, right, it might be the kid who's taking piano lessons and gymnastics lessons and all kinds of different things. And again, the parent or caregiver might know when certain things are happening, but I can't imagine how stressful my day would be if I didn't know what was happening when I went to work, or when I needed to teach a class, or when I needed to be in a meeting. And if I just sat in my office and occasionally someone would come and pull me to do something different, and if I had no sort of transition or preparation time.
So tell us about the Head Start study and all the longitudinal data you have gathered.
Yeah, no, so this has been a really wonderful project that started probably 15 years ago. And it was a big research group that started out, it was headed up by Helen Neville at the University of Oregon. And we really just wanted to know more about child development and especially preschool children and really thinking about supporting attention development. And so we made some partnerships with our local Head Start organizations, and we wanted to look at, were there different kinds of experiences that we could provide for children or provide for families that might help support the development of selective attention? And I can tell you very honestly, when we started this project and I was in this camp, some of us on the research team had all of the pride of cognitive scientists who thought, we can teach the child a specific skill and absolutely change their life just by a little bit of curriculum or special activity. And we were really fortunate that we had someone on our team who was getting a PhD and had a background in speech-language pathology, Jessica Fanning. And she had said, well, can I work with a group and I'm going to work with the parents? And all right, go ahead and work with the parents. And what we found after, probably 2 or 3 years of collecting data was that working with the parents was tremendously valuable at supporting their children's development. And then number 2, if we were the cognitive scientists doing different activities with the children, that doing activities that built some of these self-regulation and attention skills was pretty valuable. And so what we wanted to do was put these 2 things together. And so we built an 8-week curriculum where families would come in once per week and parents would get training in a number of these skills. And I've talked about some of them, for example, creating weekly visual schedules, also creating then daily schedules with big transitions and a number of other strategies. And while a parent trainer was really working with the parents, we also had child educators working with the children to develop skills on, saying the, oh, well, what can I do if I'm frustrated? Learning
So
to control the body, control the breath. And we found that combining these 2 things was really quite effective over an 8-week span at improving some of our standardized testing of language skills, nonverbal intelligence, but also changing brain activity for selective attention. And we saw these gains as they were much larger in kids who were getting this really evenly combined intervention or training program, working both with parents and kids, than either receiving no additional training or receiving a training that was more heavily focused on child training and really less support for the parents and caregivers. So our big take home on this was really, again, thinking about taking an approach to child development that considers first, what are some of the skills that a kiddo brings to the table and what skills can we give the kiddo? But then how can we work with parents to create some larger changes in the child's environment that can also sort of support the development of attention skills?
I think that is so brilliant. And what I love about your findings and the way you guys structured the research is that some of these things sound very intuitive, that they all will make sense or make a difference. But I think once you have concretized it and measured it and shown progress and gains have sustained themselves, that is a very powerful message and really an invitation to make a deeper family teacher collaboration, and really for parents to see the wisdom in doing that together. Can you just tell us why it was so effective compared to what was so special about this joint effort versus or rather addressing only one?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's always frustrating scientifically because we don't know for sure what was the magical ingredient or what was it about this combined training that was the most effective. I can say that one of the things that we also measured, and parents might be interested to hear this, is parenting stress. And so being a parent is a stressful activity. And we found that in this combined training program, in addition, parents were reporting lower levels of parenting stress and kind of an increase in their parenting confidence. And so one of our hypotheses is, you think about how much time a child spends at home. And to the extent that parents were having an opportunity to learn some new strategies and try them out, that in a sense, we could be continuing to have an effect in all of these other hours of the child's day And so, it could kind of bleed out into the larger environment. And in some ways, then you can think in some ways of parents become, right, interventionists or support staff. And parents also had more knowledge of some of the strategies and activities that kids were learning with the teacher. And so they could be reinforcing some of those skills. And
I think that's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, one of the things that we would talk about a lot in our research group is we would meet these families, and every parent wants the best for their child. Every parent does. And some of the challenges are, how do you deal with managing some of the stressors that are present in everyone's life? And how do you give parents different sets of tools to try? And it was always sort of this weekly curriculum was introducing an idea or a strategy, letting parents try it out and checking in with parents midweek to see how is this strategy working, and really encouraging parents to become scientists themselves in terms of learning a strategy and monitoring, how am I doing at implementing the strategy? Is it having, tracking their child's responsiveness? And that would allow a parent to see either, if I'm really observing my own behavior, maybe I'm not quite doing this strategy correctly, or hopefully to see some of the positive benefits. And that could become sort of a self-reinforcing loop that, kind of encouraged parents around continuing to try and explore these strategies.
I think I say this often, that there's an apple and then there's a tree. So those children who are struggling with executive function, self-regulation, attention, also have parents who have struggled maybe when they were younger or continue to struggle when things are complex and stressful, as you mentioned. But I do agree with you and see incredible value that this is a nudge to self-evaluate. When you are asked to follow a protocol and gauge your child's behavior and performance, you can see on a chart that, oh, shoot, I haven't done that in the last 2 days. And that can itself kind of you begin to regulate yourself. And once you begin to regulate, your child is going to certainly benefit. That's wonderful. So as we end our show, is there anything that you think that is what gets you excited about the field that you're in and makes you very, optimistic about the future for the next generation of kids getting better support?
I'm really excited, and our research falls into this category by the studies really showing the capacity for the brain to change and thinking about the plasticity that's there, which really provides a huge optimized some people might find it a little bit scary, thinking my brain responds to my environment. If my environment isn't optimized, am I in trouble? But really, I think the story that we're seeing is definitely one of resilience and possibility, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism.
You're such an incredibly resilient and positive person. So everybody who comes in contact with you and all the research you are doing is going to have incredible impact, just as it has had so far. So I am so thrilled to know you personally, and our conversation was extremely meaningful. And thank you for your time, Courtney, today. And hope you will come back after some time so we can discuss neuroplasticity even in more in-depth way.
Yeah, no, would be happy to anytime. And I am just grateful for your work as a clinician and interest in the science and in making science more broadly accessible. And I hope that listeners, and especially those who are parents, hear this and feel somewhat empowered about learning about different strategies, testing things out, and supporting their children.
All right. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, today's guest, Dr. Courtney Stevens, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thanks for listening today. And we look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.